Bien, bonsoir. Nous allons commencer cette séance. Elle va nous amener à nous interroger sur les problèmes de perception et de représentation du risque. Il y a un classique en matière de risque, un premier classique qui est d'opposer l'irrationalité de l'opinion publique à la rationalité des experts. Un autre classique consiste à opposer la sagesse populaire à l'image du savant fou. Le problème qui va nous être posé est donc de savoir comment naviguer entre ces deux images contrastées. Quelles sont les leçons que l'on peut tirer des travaux en psychologie appliquée, en sociologie. On sait que certains travaux de psychologie insistent sur la notion de biais, de perception. On sait aussi que les sociologues insistent sur des notions comme la construction sociale du risque, la culture du risque, et que psychologues et sociologues ne s'entendent pas toujours sur la manière d'aborder cette présentation. Alors, entre perception, représentation et construction sociale, voilà le thème de cette soirée. Pour cela, deux intervenants. Le professeur Ortwin Renn de l'université de Stuttgart. Psychologie sociale, sociologie sont ses deux références. Il a dirigé pendant plus d'une dizaine d'années un centre à Stuttgart d'évaluation technologique. Il a été aussi pendant 6 ans professeur aux États-Unis sur des thèmes liés à la sociologie de l'environnement et à l'évaluation de la technologie et des risques. Il a notamment contribué, il y a une quinzaine d'années, à développer un modèle assez fameux concernant les processus d'amplification sociale du risque. Et plus récemment, il a fait pour la Commission européenne un travail de recherche avec toute une équipe sur la mise en œuvre du principe de précaution et des différents régimes de gouvernance du risque que l'on peut proposer pour sa mise en œuvre. Patrick Peretti-Watel est à la fois sociologue et statisticien. Il partage avec Ulrich Beck le fait d'avoir écrit des ouvrages qui s'intitulent « La société du risque ». Il a travaillé sur plusieurs sujets, évidemment, la vache folle, par exemple, mais plus spécifiquement sur les questions des conduites à risque. Conduite à risque des jeunes, par exemple, conduite à risque en milieu professionnel, des sportifs. Qu'y a-t-il derrière ces conduites à risque? S'agit-il simplement d'un déni du risque ou d'une fascination de ce risque qui permet de se révéler son identité? Ou y a-t-il là plus l'effet de normes sociales autour des idées de performance, d'excellence, qui s'imposeraient en fait sous la forme de prise de risque? Voilà quelques-unes des questions qui vont vous être abordées aujourd'hui. Le professeur Renn s'exprimera en premier lieu. Il le fera en anglais. Et c'est pour ça que vous avez des écouteurs qui vous permettront d'accéder à la traduction en français sur le canal numéro 1. Après l'exposé du professeur Renn, nous aurons une phase de questions et débats avec lui, car il devra nous quitter avant la fin de la séance. Et après cette première phase, nous aurons l'exposé de Patrick Peretti-Watel. Voilà, nous allons les écouter à présent. Ortwin.
Thank you very much, Olivier, for this introduction. I would like to start out, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, with an apology. First, that I speak English in a French audience, and I know that this is a real offense. But unfortunately, I was trained in school with Latin and Greek, and I just didn't have the energy also to learn French. I know it was a mistake, but I hope you forgive me. And secondly, I have to leave earlier this evening. This was also a mistake on my side, but I will be here for an hour, and I hope that I can entertain all your questions. The subject of tonight is a very interesting and a very exciting subject. It is how our brain perceives risky situation, how it deals with situations in which we have to make choices under uncertainty, and what we know about these choices and how they are made, partially from a psychological perspective and partially from a sociological perspective. Tonight I will cover 3 different areas. The first area is that I would like to talk a little bit about the specific characteristics of risk. Why is risk such an interesting subject, and why do we deal with risks in such an elaborated way? Secondly, I would like to introduce you to some of the research that many colleagues and I myself have done in terms of understanding the perception and evaluation of risks by ordinary people just like me and you. How do we deal with issues of uncertainty? And thirdly, I would like to link this insight from risk perception research to the issue of what does it mean for policy making? Is there anything we can learn from risk perception to improve our handling of risk? Or is it just that we should follow the scientific advice of risk researchers? And one of my main theses will be it's not enough just to do technical risk assessment. It is also very important to look at risk perceptions and use them partly as a base for risk policy making. Let me start with my part number 1. What is so special about risks, and what are the challenges for public perception and communication? There are 3 main characteristics of risk that make communication about risk very difficult, and also its scientific assessment as well as its policy making. The first one is that most of the risks that we face today are highly complex. Now that's almost a fashionable word. What we mean with complex is that between the causal impact and the effect, there are a couple of intervening variables that make it very difficult to really understand the causal chain. Now, if somebody gets cancer or somebody gets a specific disease, we're not quite sure what is the reason for this. Is it exposure to some kind of environmental factor? Is it an exposure to some eating habit? Is it something else, a genetic defect or something else? So we are always struggling about what are the cause and the effect. If we know some of the potential agents like pollution, we still don't know what it actually does in different individuals. The second part of risk is uncertainty, and that is how risk is defined. We are not sure about these effects. If we're sure, we're not talking about risks, then it's damage. But uncertainty is a very tricky issue, and there are different things that are being labeled as uncertain, but they mean different things. And I've wrote down here on this slide 4 different elements of uncertainty. One element is that people vary in their response to various agents. As you all know, one can drink 1 glass of wine and feels very happy and no problem. Another person drinks 1 glass and is already drunk. So different individuals act very differently to the same agent. We call that variation among individual targets, and that's even more true for ecological damages. Secondly, we only scientifically can use a very small scaled experimental data set for inferring our conclusions about risk and damage. For example, in toxicology, scientists use mice or rats and then have to extrapolate those results to human beings. Or in epidemiology, we're trying to compare a population that is exposed to a specific hazard with another population that's not exposed. But unfortunately, these 2 populations differ also in other things. That means we never can be sure about what we talk and what we say about the risks that we are faced with. Now, we call this errors in terms of measurement or in terms of random variation. There are specific statistical methods to deal with it with so-called confidence intervals, but again, it's something that creates more uncertainty. Thirdly, specifically in the health field, we have what we call genuine stochastic relationships, that something can happen, for example, on a molecular basis, that just 1 molecule can change your molecular setup in your cell, but it may not. So there is something like a degree of freedom even in the natural science type. And even if you are in a very, very small particle world, you know that there's a lot of indeterminacy around. These kind of stochastic relationships are very difficult to grasp, and it means from a scientific position we can never make any real conclusion for individuals, just for very large populations. And there you have a lot of uncertainty involved. And lastly, and that is most important, we always can think in terms of targets. So we look at cancer, we maybe look at Alzheimer, we may look at ecological damage, we may look at some specific type of increment that we are looking at, but we always exclude other things that might happen. And that's what we call system boundaries. We can only think within system boundaries. And very often we can see that something that we thought was very safe happened to be not very safe. Think about CFCs, for example. When they were introduced into the production world, everybody thought this was a very stable element. And so it would not cause any harm. But then later on it was found that it destroys the ozone layer. And so the system boundaries at that time were set towards medical, physical damage, and was not expanded to potential damage of the atmosphere. Then there's a third element that is sometimes mistaken with uncertainty, and that is ambiguity. What do we mean with ambiguity? Ambiguity means that what we would like to accomplish with some activities that is uncertain, that has a risk, is contested even when we look at the intended consequences, not just the non-intended consequences. Take the example of stem cell research. Some people believe that stem cell research is something that would violate human rights because stem cells is a part of an embryo and that's a human being. And others believe those are just cells. And so depending on what kind of value you share, you believe that the consequences are very bad or very good. And it's not the uncertainty about it. You know exactly what you're doing. It's not the complexity really that bothers you. It's your interpretation of what is life. And we can see this specifically in biotechnology issues, but also in many other issues, energy issues, for example, or in agriculture, where people have very different opinions, not on what can happen, but whether it's good, what is intended with the activity that is risky. Now, all of these three things are very difficult to communicate between science and the public, among scientists and among policymakers and among the various publics. Because complexity is something where our intuition very often fails, and I'll get back to that. Uncertainty is something where we certainly have a strong feeling we would like to reduce this, and sometimes we reduce it to an extent that is not appropriate for the things that we are looking at. And ambiguity is something which is almost impossible to resolve because it's based on human values that we share or do not share. Now, there is a new type of risk which we call systemic risks. Systemic risks are being coined by the OECD. There's even a group on dealing with systemic risks, and they have specific characteristics. They are highly complex. They have a lot of what we call second-order uncertainty, so a lot of ignorance involved, a lot of stochastic relationships. They have a high degree of ambiguity because people believe, well, it's good or bad. They have a lot of value-laden aspects associated with them. And they usually have open system boundaries. If they happen in one country, they then spread over, maybe even symbolically or psychologically, to other countries. BSE is a very good example for this. And the problems there is we usually have the probability distribution that we're not quite sure about. We have ripple effects beyond the immediate risk source. Just think of BSE, how much political turmoil that has caused, and we have normally high social mobilization. A good example for such a systemic risk is novel food or genetically modified organisms. The health impacts are very complex. We have little knowledge about probabilities of very unlikely events. The benefits are highly contested. That's the ambiguity issues. And there are non-risk ambiguities involved, whether we like to change nature, whether we want to introduce some human engineering into evolution. Those are big value questions that we have to face. And the problems, of course, are many people are exposed to it, so there's a lot of emotion, a lot of mass attraction. There's a concern about lack of choice, either from one side or the other, and high social mobilization. Now, I would like to finish this part number one, just showing you that in risk there is a lot of potential for controversy, a lot of potential for social process, and a lot of potential also for misunderstandings, because complexity, uncertainty, and ambiguity are not easy to resolve, and that is why it's so important also to look at the perception of risk. How do people actually perceive these three elements of risk, and how do they cope with the difficulties that lie in the risk structure? So I come to part number two. What do we know about risk perception? The first thing I think I would like to point out is that human behavior depends on perceptions, not on facts. Now, they may not even depend only on perceptions, they depend on many other things, but they at least depend on what scientists would call facts. In the long run, facts and perceptions may somehow coincide, because in the long run we cannot live against reality. But the first driver for people's behavior is their perception. And that's why it is very important to talk about perceptions. Number two is perceptions are not just irrational clusters of individual behavior. We know from psychological work as well as from sociological work that there are specific clusters of risk perception that we can find in different societies and different subcultures, almost in each individual. So it is something that can be systematically researched, and it's not something where we say, well, each individual is different, we can't say anything about specific generalized universal patterns of risk perception. And the reason for this is that through evolution of humankind, we are one of the mammals that have basically four strategies for coping with danger. And the four strategies are: either we fight if we see a danger, we flee, just run away, we play dead, hoping that whatever the tiger, whatever it is, wouldn't notice it, or if it's something new, we might also test it. So curiosity is another strategy for risk management. And it's quite interesting that these four genuine coping strategies of people can be found in more sophisticated cultural ways for humans to cope with risky or dangerous situations, to deal with threats. And very often in dangerous situations, people are not very ready, not willing to look at information about probabilities, information about what is the likelihood that something is happening, because that's not an intrinsic pattern of their risk coping structure. It's neither fight nor flight nor playing dead, or not really testing. So this is a more sophisticated way of responding to risk, and the more immediate one is one of these behavioral relations. And it's very interesting, when we had the anthrax scare in Germany after September 11th, and I was asked to advise those people who telephoned with all the concerned citizens. So many citizens phoned in and said, what can we do about the anthrax scare? The people at the Institute first tried to say, look, the probability is extremely low, don't worry. And they were not very happy with that. Not at all. They said, well, we are worried. You know, don't downplay our worry, our concern. Secondly, what they were saying, look, do you really think that bin Laden is approaching you? You are whatever, a clerk or something else. Wouldn't he rather position his weapon to a high politician or somebody else? And they said, no, within the United States, we're ordinary people. It all didn't work. So then we had a couple of questions just to test whether those people were rather the fight type or the flight type. And if we knew about who they were, then we would give behavioral suggestion. For the fight type, it was, you know, what can you do when you open your mail, how to protect yourself, and so on. So that was very highly appreciated. For the flight type, it was just throw your mail away. If it's a bill, it will get back to you. If it's not a bill, don't worry. And it was one of those issues where you could see that one or the other type of people was very satisfied. We tested this later on, so that this kind of genuine types of psychological behavior was very strong in the face of an immediate danger. Now, if we look more systematically at this, we have different approaches to study risk perception. The first one is the called psychometric paradigm, and the psychometric paradigm basically consists of three elements. One is what we call intuitive heuristics. Intuitive heuristics are ways of generalization of any kind of risk behavior towards something like a conclusion, is it dangerous or not. Secondly is qualitative risk characteristics. These are characteristics either of the risk itself or of the situation that help us to decide whether to worry or not. And thirdly, there are semantic images. It's kind of a combination of these heuristics and our qualitative risk characteristics. Images are like drawers. And if some risk candidate comes on, and you need to evaluate this, then you have specific drawers, some kind of key question, and then you put in the first, the second, or third drawer, and that is a simplification strategy to deal with a very complex world. I get back to this. Secondly, we have sociological approaches, and sociological approaches are approaches where we ask for social clusters, clusters that are not just belonging to one individual or a specific anthropological idea of risk coping, but it's more on a social process of generating and evaluating risk. There again are three elements I would like to point out. One is that risk is a very good element for social mobilization and protest movements. All environmental protest movements have used risk as a motivator to get people joining the environmental movement, because with uncertainty you can basically scare people. When you scare people, they get motivated, and then they may join you. Secondly, the social amplification of risk is something where specific elements of risk seem to amplify the threat, and other elements of risk seem to attenuate the risk. So there's something that is a social process in which the risk is being either heightened or lowered depending on specific variables. And thirdly, there's a social theory of reflexive modernization. That is something Ulrich Beck was mentioned before. His basic thesis is that today the political struggle is not so much on the distribution of wealth or the distribution of power, but on the distribution of risk. Powerful people transpose risk on the less powerful people. And so that this is a new kind of class struggle. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on which side you are, Beck says this is a boomerang effect, because modern risks really affect everyone. So even the powerful people in the end will be affected by the risks that they generate and try to impose on others. And lastly, there are so-called cultural theories of risk, which look at specific cultural clusters in which risks are being framed. And framing means what is the concept of risk in different subcultures and cultures, and how do they differ. Now, I would like to go briefly through some of these paradigms here. Intuitive biases and heuristics, those are processes of information about uncertainty that lead to generalizations. And I don't want to go too deeply into each of them, but let me take out one, for example, the availability bias. The availability bias tells us that if something is readily available in your memory, you overestimate its probability. So if you know someone, for example, who has been struck by lightning, you think lightning is a real probable danger. If you had been involved in a car accident lately, you think this is a really likely event. If you haven't been involved in a car accident for 25 years, you think all of these reports about accidents are exaggerated. That's the availability bias. There are other ones, and we can get back to it in the discussion if you like me to. Secondly, there are so-called qualitative characteristics. These are kinds of modifiers of judgment. They help us to judge a situation as risky or as dangerous, in addition to just the seriousness of risks. And there are two types of qualitative characteristics. One are with respect to the nature of risk, and there are some I've listed here. So if something leads to significantly negative impacts, for example, if you are in a plane and somebody says something is wrong with the engine, we cannot land, you know that's the end of your life. And that's why a lot of people fear being in a plane. If you're in a car and you have some problems, you still feel, well, if something happens, probably I will survive. I may have a broken leg or something, but I will survive. And that gives you more comfort. That's a dread factor. Familiarity. If you're very familiar with the risk, you think the probability is low because you think you can master it. If it's very novel and new, you think it's high. Personal experience, perception by human senses, I think that's very obvious. And another one which is interesting, more cultural one, natural risks are being normally attenuated and artificial technological risks are amplified. Now, there are other qualitative characteristics with respect to the risk situation. So if you take a risk voluntarily, you think it's lower than if it's imposed on you. If you believe you can control the risk, like in a car again, if you're the driver, you think you are in charge of the risk, you can know it. Well, that's very often an illusion, but you believe that. And so you think that car driving, or your car driving, is much safer than the average car driver. And there's been wonderful studies in Sweden by Ortwin who found out that 80% of the drivers believe they're better drivers than anybody else. Now, if it's 80% believing that, it can't be true because it's more, well, only 20% left. And to that extent, it's quite interesting that we have this overconfidence in our own ability to master risks. Fair distribution of risk and benefits is another very important element. If you think that those risks are fairly distributed, that those who get the benefits will also take the risks, and vice versa, we normally attenuate the risks. And lastly, if you have confidence in risk management, if you think somebody does it properly, we believe the risk is lower than if we feel that management is not very good. All of these qualitative characteristics can be condensed in something what we call semantic images. And these semantic images are very powerful because they guide partially our perception, they also guide partially our behavior towards risks. And I've listed here 5 dominant semantic images, and I just would like to take out one because I cannot explain all 5 of them. It's the creeping danger one. The creeping danger is a very interesting risk type. It's one where we don't have a sensic perception of the dangerous situation. We can't see it, we can't hear it, we can't really taste it, like, for example, in food additives, or like something in drinking water, or radiation in the air. These types of risk, we depend on experts that tell us whether there is a risk or not, because personally we don't have the experience. And normally there's a long latency period between the intake and the potential damage. Think of cancer, for example, maybe 10, 11 or more years. If that is a type of risk, then there's one crucial question people ask. Do I trust those people that tell me about these risks, or do not trust them? If I trust them, I'm willing to take some kind of risk. If I don't trust them, I demand zero risk. Not because I'm totally risk averse, or I would not go out on the street because you know that there's no zero risk out there. But if I distrust those people that inform me about the seriousness of the risk, then the only logical choice is to say, then I want zero risk. And that's why it sometimes appears that people are inconsistent. That people say, we don't want this radiation. We want zero radiation, but smoke. Well knowing that smoking is much more dangerous than the radiation. But if you don't trust those people who tell you about the risk, then you say, then I don't want any of it. And that is a very, very powerful semantic image and explains a lot about what we actually observe in the public debate. And that drives policymakers and a lot of natural scientists mad, because they say, why is accepting a risk like smoking or like driving a car, but they will not accept a minute risk of genetically modified organisms? Well, if distrust is there, that is very well explainable. And that is one of the key issues. And I will not go further into it, but certainly in the discussion we can do this. So there are other risk clusters here, and all of them have the same kind of story behind it. Once you understand the story behind it, you understand the behavior. Then it's very logical. If you don't understand the story, it looks irrational. Well, novel food, again, I've used one example here, is a very interesting example for the creeping danger thing. We have the concern about long-term impacts. We have the desire for zero risk. The perception is artificial and unnatural. And the key variable is, do you have trust and confidence in those who do the risk management? There's also high sensibility for symbolic aspects of risk. Just think about BSE and GMOs. And there is real reactions by people. Consumers do react to health threats from food. Now, this is more or less a psychological part of it, and I can only give you an overview. Of course, there's much more to say about it, but I also would like at least to mention the sociological approaches. And there's one thing that I said is social mobilization. A lot of protest groups use risk almost as a piggyback for transporting their specific concern, environmental concern or other thing. And risk has become a symbol, one, for inequity, that some people are exposed to more risk than others, and that of course mobilizes their emotions. Or that risk is almost a scapegoat if you don't like the modernization lines of society. If you think industrialization of agriculture is not a good thing, if you think that the pace of time that we are using in industrial societies is too fast, too intense, and if all of that is part of the belief, you can use risk almost as a very good symbol to mobilize people. Secondly, you have the social amplification of risk paradigm. The social amplification, as said, is one where you look for social factors that either amplify the perception of risk or attenuate. Some of these amplification factors are those that I mentioned before, the qualitative risk characteristics. But there are others. For example, high media coverage increases availability, increases and amplifies risk perception. There is something like failure of management. If you can blame someone, certainly it increases your attention, and then it increases your risk perception. And there are other things like attenuation. If you're used to it for a long time, let's say a radon, natural radon, creeping into your basements, sometimes much higher radiation than in the vicinity of nuclear power plants, nobody's really concerned about it because the risk is familiar, it's in your home, it's natural, so why worry? So these are attenuators. And the last one, I said, reflexive modernization, and I just like to cover this one. It's a very complex theory. It's something about that in the second modernization, as Ulrich Beck points it out, this is a phase in which we live today, in which the old values of modernization, that everything is getting better, that science is progressing, that everything gets faster, richer, better, is being jeopardized by a lot of scandals, and that most people are very skeptical about these goals of the old modernization. And now institutions are forced to legitimize, to justify themselves all the times, because the reference values are always moving. It's not just one reference value anymore. There are moving reference values, and they change over time, just like fashions. And if they don't catch the right reference values, their institutions will be under real attack. And risk is again one of these lubricants in Beck's work that have a very high impact on the justification side. Either you justify risks by saying this is your reference, well then you may get in real trouble, or you have to use other reference points which are more socially acceptable, and within that reflexive, you have always go back and forth, modernization, then risk becomes again a very important part of societal coping with its present challenges, and that's why Beck called it the risk society. The book was published in 1986. Now, the last one I would like to mention is a cultural approach to risk. And a cultural approach has the hypothesis, or the main thesis, that all risks are socially constructed. That means there are real threats outside the world. People die. But when we frame it as risk, it's always a social process of communication, of putting things together, and it is a social choice phenomenon. And there are main subcultures. There are the entrepreneurs, a subculture that likes risks. Risk is opportunity. There are the egalitarians. They hate risks because it threatens an equitable distribution of resources. There are the bureaucrats. They only like risks if they're properly managed. The belief in bureaucratic management. And you have the atomized individuals, and they believe in nothing. They don't think that we can master risks. They don't think we can deal with risks at all. And they're the kinds of fatalists that just say risks come and go, and nobody really has a handle on them. And each group of these four has a distinct epistemology. It means they have their own way of thinking about and believing about risk. And it's independent of any kind of scientific endeavor. It's part of the cultural belief system. And you also have a specific normative belief system. Now, the last point I would like to raise now in my last part, and I will do this very briefly, is where do we go from here? What is the purpose of looking into risk perceptions? Are there any real policy implications, conclusions that we can draw from this? What is the role of perception for risk management? The first thing, in any democratic society, concerns of people are always legitimate. Concerns are never illegitimate. What does that mean? It means that if somebody worries about some kind of factor, we need to look at this factor. Now, it may be that that factor is not as bad as people thought. That is a real major role of science to find this out. But the concern itself is always legitimate. So, in terms of risk management, we need to take these concerns seriously and use them also as criteria for evaluating various risk activities. So we need additional evaluative criteria. We need to include collective concerns. Individual concerns is more difficult, such as manageability, ubiquity, persistence, things that people feel are elements of judging risks. And we can try also to individualize those concerns that are only part of the individual portfolio, like voluntariness. What is voluntary for one may be imposed on others. Cannot have collective action on this. But the main thing here is that the magnitudes of concerns may be distorted. That's why we have science, to find out what are actually the scale and the magnitude of each concern that people have in terms of the real implications. But the concerns themselves should always be considered as legitimate. And by revealing these concerns, you can also come closer between policymaker and perceptions. If people have the feeling that their concerns are taken seriously, that they're taken up, even if it turns out that their concerns are not justified, because the magnitude is very low, that is something they can accept. If they feel their concerns are neglected, then they're really upset about it. Now, let me drop this one. It's not. I would like to come to my conclusions. First thing, people behave according to perceptions, not facts. And that is why perceptions are so crucial for policymaking as well as for understanding people's behavior. Perceptions follow fairly consistent patterns. The expression may vary from subculture to subculture, from culture to culture, as cultural theory has shown, but there are some dominant universal traits that have been found in empirical research in almost any country in the world. Some of these experiments are very easy to conduct, and they have been conducted in Africa, in Asia, in the United States, with very, very similar results, interestingly enough. There are dominant perception clusters that govern this intuitive evaluation of risk. It's very important for policymakers to know them, but also for just people to know them, because then they can observe themselves much better, and they know why they feel one way or the other. Risk perception has been studied by psychology, sociology, by cultural theory. Each of them have contributed something to a better understanding of risk. They are more supplementary, not really substitutional. And the psychological research focused on these more universal patterns of risk perception. Sociological research more on the interface between social development and collective patterns of risk. And the cultural theory more on the social cultural construction of what people believe is risky or less risky. So social amplification frameworks that I also briefly addressed is one of these more integrative approaches where we can understand how individuals and social groups process risk and use amplifiers and attenuators for evaluating the seriousness of risks. Risks communication needs to address these various perception issues, and even within perception it makes a lot of sense to distinguish between complexity, uncertainty, and ambiguity, because these are also the elements we can find in risk perception research. And that may be the link between the scientific assessment of risk and the perception and the policy of risk, that we all concentrate and focus on these three major elements and then find out what are the concerns within each of these elements. How do we measure these concerns? How can we make sure that these concerns are justified or were exaggerated or attenuated? And then start a communication program that helps to bridge the gap between the risk assessment, the risk perception, and the risk management. Thank you very much.
Eh bien, je vous propose de poser des questions, d'éclaircissements ou des commentaires. Vous pouvez les faire en français, ils seront traduits en anglais sur le canal 2 pour que Ortwin Renn puisse les comprendre.
Monsieur Voilà.
Bah.
Deux questions. First,
Oui.
First, I would like to thank you for this very interesting lecture that covered a very wide range of theories about risk perception. I've got just two questions or two remarks. To what extent do you think that uncertainty and ambiguity could be fueled by our very efforts to reduce them through producing more and more data that we are not able to understand? Mm-hmm. This is my first question. And my second one is related to the strategies that you quote concerning coping with threats. You said that you can fight, flight, play dead, or test a risk. But what about denying a risk by cognitive rather than a behavioral adaptation?
Yes, well, thank you very much. I think the last question is very easy to respond to. Denial, I think, is a very typical aspect of playing dead. What you do in playing dead in an animal behavior set is that you reduce your activity, you kind of negate the threat, and then you start exactly where you ended. And give you one example in the modern application. When we studied approaches of people to BSE, we found out there's a percentage of people who stopped eating beef immediately, stopped eating it, and then when kind of the apprehension level was again lower, it was not so reported again, started to eat this exactly same amount of beef that they did before. So it was like they just slept for a while and then they started with exactly the same behavior. Whereas the people who fought, who was actively changing their behavior, actually adopted some of these changes over time. Fighting people normally adopt their behavior, playing dead people don't. So denial is, I think, a very typical expression of this. This first question is a very sophisticated question because human beings, and that's part of the social science dilemma, create their self-fulfilling prophecies. That means they sometimes create a situation that they want to explore or that they want to manipulate or to manage. And that is, if you have a risk source where you put a lot of emphasis, for example, on looking at uncertainty and ambiguity, many people will feel, oh, there must be something very serious if you put so much effort into this. And a good example, for example, is Switzerland, mobile phones. Switzerland has the strictest standards for mobile phone antennas, 10 times stricter than anybody else in the world. Now, the Swiss people are not happier than us. As a matter of fact, they're unhappier. And if you ask them, they say, there must be a reason for our Swiss authorities to do this. They probably know more than the others, and it's much more dangerous. That's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you try to be more cautious than others, people think there must be a reason behind it. And it's not just to satisfy the others. So this is kind of the resolving door problem that we have seen very often in also social psychology. And it's difficult to study, and I think you cannot avoid it. It's something that you can create the dangers, and sometimes you even intrigue these dangers and initiate them by making efforts to manage them.
Des questions? Je vois pas bien.
Est-ce que, je pose la question en français, est-ce que vous adhérez complètement aux analyses de Beck sur le changement de paradigme de la modernité, sur l'idée que nous sommes entrés dans une deuxième modernité, marquée par la société du risque?
Could the translator try this again, because I didn't.
Do you agree with Beck's analysis about the change of modernity and the entrance into a second age of modernity?
Yes and no. I disagree with Beck on his analysis that risks have increased over time. Now we all get older, and most of our dangers have just been transformed into something that we can now master or that we can now change. And that gives the perception that risks have increased. But if you look really at statistical level, they haven't increased. And I think Beck takes the perception for the reality. That's something where I disagree. I agree with him that some of these old-fashioned values that have really inspired the first modernity has come under severe scrutiny and have been really felt on skeptical ears in modern society. And some of the kind of postmodern movements which go into even not believing in rationality at all anymore is one of these expressions of the second modernity.
Autre question?
That's the right one too. Oh, thank you.
I have one.
Yeah.
Je la formulerai en français. Vous avez exposé différentes théories, psychologiques, sociologiques, culturelles. Peut-on les intégrer dans un seul schéma théorique ou reposent-elles sur des hypothèses incompatibles entre elles? Et à ce moment-là, quelles conclusions en tirer du point de vue des politiques en matière de risque?
Again, that's a very difficult and not easy to answer question. My main feeling is that these different approaches look at a phenomenon in various facets. It's just like if you have a gem, you know, you have different surfaces. And each of the surfaces is true, but if you just keep looking on one of the surfaces, you miss all the others. But you cannot just use one to describe the others. And my feeling is that depending on the problem that you're studying, you're better off using some of the psychological work. And if you study other phenomena, you may look better at some of the sociological work. Or if you study maybe intercultural comparisons, it's better to look at some of the cultural elements. There is no integrative theory in the sense because social reality has this complexity. We act as individuals, we act as social beings, and we act as cultural entities. And although it is integrated in ourselves, we still have these different factors in us. And science is part of dividing these things again in order not to get inundated with all that complexity. So I would say there is no unified theory in social sciences, and probably not even in physics, although we're looking for it. And this kind of diverse theories have to be matched with the type of problem we want to study. And that's why it's important we know all these theories, so we're not looking at the wrong facet to answer questions that are really mirrors of the other facet. Okay, now I have to excuse myself. I'm, again, very grateful for your patience and hope that I had enlightened you a little bit tonight. Thank you very much.